Hello and welcome back to Charge. With me in the studio is my co-host Maria Christina.
Hi.
And our guest today, Anjalee Sewpaul.
Hello.
Anjalee is CEO of Deja, and they are actually a client of Develops. Because we're so lucky to be behind the scenes on the build of Deja, we know all about the code, but what about the ideas? Deja is rethinking what loyalty means between shop and customer. Our topic in this episode is loyalty and the way in which it can be treated as a currency. So Ange, tell us a bit about what Deja is.
So Deja is a loyalty as a service that I'm currently offering to restaurants. So the idea is pretty simple. You download the app, and every time you go to a restaurant, you gain a tier point. And the more you go, the more tier points you get, and the higher your tier. And you can unlock different experiences to reward you for your loyalty.
And can you tell us a bit about how you came to this idea and your background?
Yeah, sure. So a bit about my background first is that I guess this all started with the idea when I was 5 that I wanted to be a chef, which seems like very far away from how I got to this point in my life. But basically I was always passionate about food, and I had wanted to go to culinary school and do that whole shebang. I was all about Julia Child and all that kind of stuff. You guys know Julia Child, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I
I
asked another British
Meryl
person.
Streep film.
Okay, cool, all right. Meryl,
I like food.
leading the way. So when I eventually got to the point where I was apprenticing in a restaurant, I realized that being a chef and having aspirations of being a chef were totally different, and I decided that that wasn't the path for me. I then ended up becoming a consultant for a large consultancy firm, dealing with lots of IT development projects and all that kind of stuff. But as I was thinking about my life and where things were leading me, I thought I really want to get back into food because that passion was still there. So I started to try and think of a way to get back into it that wasn't me actually being physically in the kitchen, even though my claim to fame is cooking for Yoko Ono on my first day. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Not bad.
Yeah,
Not
I know.
bad.
I didn't recognize her, but I was like, hey!
Did she enjoy the food?
I hope she did. I hope she did.
She smiled and she nodded.
Yeah, she's still alive, guys. So it was from that and a mixture of going to some of my favorite restaurants time and time again and seeing that there was kind of a gap in the market in terms of how loyalty was being perceived at some of these restaurants that were just on my doorstep that I came up with the idea of Deja.
Can you tell us a bit more about what you mean by how the loyalty was perceived? Because I think Deja is changing how we perceive loyalty, and that's your thing. So what was the starting point, and what about that do you want to change?
So the starting point was, in a nutshell, every time I went to this restaurant, and I was going quite frequently towards the end of my consultancy career because, needed a pep in my life, it was the fact that every time I went, obviously the staff would start to recognize me and they start to give me free things, I guess, a free starter or some cocktails, and I developed this relationship with them, which was really nice because you start to be valued for you as an individual, and you know their name and they know yours, and it was kind of that dynamic. But then this particular restaurant opened up a few more restaurants within London, and their staff shifted around. So I went again another time, and no one recognized me. And it kind of hits you in a place where you're like, oh, all of a sudden you're not special anymore. And if I had maybe been booking with a different system, they might have been able to access my guest notes. But otherwise, if I just walked into the restaurant, they had no way, except for a personal interaction, to know who I was or to value me as a customer. And I thought about it. I was like, what's to stop me or any other person from going to a different restaurant when I've lost that personal interaction, that sort of experience with individuals within the restaurant? Mm-hmm. So I thought it's a perfect time to sort of think about loyalty that goes beyond just fiscal rewards, but it's about the experience of your dining or experience of your trip to that particular restaurant.
Yeah, and that ties in quite nicely with this whole idea that our generation is fixated with experiences rather than objects, rather than owning things.
Yeah.
So it's tapping into that feeling special thing that in London sometimes gets lost because it is so large.
Exactly. And also when you have a market that's so saturated with restaurants and choices are literally on your doorstep, if I walk down my street 100 meters, I'll probably pass about 10 restaurants. What's to stop me from saying, well, actually, I don't want steak at this place, I want steak at that place? Mm-hmm. I think a lot of the time it has to do with your experience rather than the level or the quality of the food, because it might be quite similar. But I think that is something that restaurants in particular need to start thinking a lot more about.
And on the other side, so you're saying, okay, you saw a gap in the market from the consumer side, but what about from the restaurant side? What's their what's the gap in their market for having loyal customers who come back time and time again?
Yeah, I think there's a trifecta, if you will, of different reasons why a restaurant can benefit from something like loyalty. Obviously, you want to retain your loyal customers because that just basically means that you're going to get more business from them. And if you just look at the numbers, for example, I think OpenTable did a study a few years ago where on average, people in London were spending about £70 a week on food. So let's say you went to a restaurant even twice a month and you spent £70 for 2 people. If you are able to retain 20 of those customers over a year and ask them to come one more time to that restaurant, you've already made over £150,000 for only 20 people of retention. I mean, that in itself is huge. I think the other thing is brand awareness. So word of mouth marketing is something that I don't think you can take for granted. If you have people who are loyal to a restaurant and they say, well, why should we go to Hawksmoor instead of going to Gaucho's? If someone says in your group of friends like, oh, well, Hawksmoor is awesome, we should definitely go there, you're probably going to get a lot more people who are going to go to Hawksmoor than Gaucho's in that friend group.
A lot more reliable than seeing an ad that says this place is fantastic.
Exactly, yeah. And one of the really interesting things that I found when I was talking to different restaurants about this idea was actually the point of view of the employees within the restaurant, which I hadn't really thought of until that point. And they were saying that one of the best parts of their job was actually the interactions they had with their regulars.
Okay.
And it kind of enhanced their experience as employees there, and they became much more, I guess, incorporated into the brand, into the business. So it didn't just feel like a job, it was, a community of people that they could see day in and day out. And for a restaurant, you're not only increasing the value and the frequency of your customers, but you're increasing the value of your employees who can then give back more into your brand. You can even tie that back to stuff like research and development, right? So like if a restaurant wants to try out something new and they have customers who are giving good feedback to employees because they trust them and vice versa, you might be able to get better ideas from your customers because you know that they're loyal, and from your employees as well. So I think it kind of goes hand in hand. So there's 2 sides of that.
So the standard format for loyalty at, say, a coffee shop is going to be one of those little stamp cards.
Yeah.
Right. But you're focusing on experience, and as you say, it's almost evidencing the relationship between the waitress and the customer. How can you incorporate that sort of emotional, human aspect into an app?
That's a very interesting question. So I think this is one of the main things that I struggled with when I was thinking about an idea for Deja Vu, because one of the main things is obviously that it's about the experience and in creating an exclusive environment for customers to unlock benefits to them that other people can't. But there's also the idea that you don't want them totally interacting on their phone continuously, and it almost distracts them from the actual thing that you're trying to reward them for. So I guess the first and foremost is that I wanted to keep it simple. So, at least for the MVP of the product, you go into the restaurant, you collect tier points, and when you first download the app, everyone unlocks a certain type of benefit. So, it might be a free glass of wine or a free starter or whatever. And as you move up in your tier, you are able to unlock different things that people can't experience. So, priority booking or new menus that other people aren't able to have access to. And I think it's the idea that if the restaurant is able to understand you more as a consumer, they're able to offer those different types of rewards based on like what they know that you like. And it's not just a 1-for-1 bartering system like you would use for, if you went into a coffee shop and you got a stamp on your card and you got, after 10 visits you got a coffee. It's saying, well, we know that these particular people like these things, or we know that we want to offer them something that they might not be able to have otherwise. Let's give them that opportunity.
I was wondering, what's Deja Vu's take on loyalty as a currency? Like, what's the difference between giving someone 20% off a receipt or a bill when you flash your app, rather than the tier system that you've come up with?
So I think it's all based on the idea of experiences, and that loyalty can be seen as a type of currency that you can use as part of like the bartering system. So for example, if we look at a coffee shop and you go for 10 visits and you get a free coffee, that's one way to look at it. And actually that's a large part of loyalty systems. I mean, if you take millennials, I think there's studies that have shown that they're more likely to sign up for loyalty schemes when there's a monetary value attached to it. But I think understanding customer behaviors is really key. And one of the main things that drives the information and drives what Deja Vu is all about. In my previous role, when I was a consultant, one of the things that we looked at actually with one of our clients was the idea of how do they look at a customer? Do you look at a customer based off of the surveys and, you know, the stuff that they say, or do you look at the holistic view of a customer? So what we actually did was we put up this model of a person on the wall for these guys to come and look at, and we said, right, so you have the head, you have the heart, and you have the feet. In the head is what are they thinking, their heart is what are they feeling, and their feet is what are they actually doing. And I think for a lot of the time when it comes to a lot of the like monetary transactions, it's more about what that customer is doing, but not necessarily what they're feeling or what they're thinking. And I think with Deja Vu, the tier system allows us in the background to understand exactly the customer behaviors and, you know, what do people want? What are they communicating to the restaurants? When do they do these things and what do they need? And then transforming that into an experience that goes beyond just saying, well, we know based on your feet that you walk into this restaurant X amount of time, so here is a bottle of wine. More like we know in your heart because of what you have done or what you have said or what we've seen in the app that you actually want to have this experience at this restaurant where you have this new menu or you can meet the chef or you can interact with other people on your level. And weirdly, I tend to bring this back in really weird situations, but the one thing that I do remember from my management degree, I remember a lot of things. I'm going to give my education a salute here, but one of the things that I carry with me is this idea of the hierarchy of needs by Maslow, which I'm probably using out of context, but I think it's really interesting because we mainly studied it when it came to employees and what they derive satisfaction from. And when you actually look at that ladder of stuff, you see that like things like eating and sleeping and your physical needs are like towards the bottom, and monetary level is somewhere down there as well, maybe like in the middle. But one of the things that's at the very top is this idea of self-actualization, that you in yourself have this confidence and you are realizing all the things that you need to do and you understand yourself as an individual. And I think a lot of that has to do with your experiences. So long story short, I think using a point system is a visual way to represent what your loyalty is at a restaurant, but understanding what lies behind those points is where Deja Vu differs when it comes to different loyalty schemes.
And will it then offer that same data-driven understanding of your clients to the restaurants? Will they have some sort of interface by which they can understand the patterns that their clients have?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that service, so I like to call Deja Vu more a service than an actual scheme, because there's a whole onslaught of things that need to happen for us to get to a point where we can understand these behaviors. And a lot of that has to do with the data analytics. And that is what we as a service offer to the restaurants. So rather than giving them, here's a spreadsheet, go and figure it out yourself, which I think a lot of different type of loyalty companies do, we offer them the ability to have this package where we say, we have identified exactly what these customers need and what they want, and we've done all the hard work for you. So now let us take some reins and help plan those events and get those rewards out there.
So it sounds that more than building a loyalty scheme, you're building a community?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the key things, because when you we're getting very existential when it comes to fine dining, but you know, if you go for a dining experience, it's not just the fact that you are exchanging money for a product. You're having an evening with your friends, with your family, with the people who work there in this environment. And I think creating a sense of community between the restaurant and the consumer is definitely something that will buy loyalty from someone, because you have that connection with them.
I think it's interesting that you characterize loyalty as a behavior and Deja Vu as a service, not a scheme. So rather like Instagram or Facebook likes used to be just like your friend saying, hey, that's great, but suddenly it becomes a thing on its own, and it's no longer your friend saying, hey, that's great, it's how many do you have, and like it's, you know, there's your friend liking it, and then there's having the Instagram like. It's got separated. And so with that scheme and then like the punch card scheme, the thing becomes the value in itself.
Yeah.
Right? It is the loyalty. The loyalty is you having the stamp cards. The loyalty is not you having been. And I think it's a really smart and very specific move to recharacterize that, because Deja Vu becomes a support system or safety net for the loyalty rather than the loyalty itself. So in the example that you gave in the very beginning, where you were going to a cafe and the owners recognized you and it was all fine.
Yeah.
You didn't need Deja Vu in that moment. When you needed it was when they expanded and their staff turned over, as cafes have very high staff turnover, and that's when you needed the support system
Yes.
in place. And I think that's really smart. I wonder if there's
Why,
any
thank
more,
you. Thought of it myself.
I wonder if you wanted to go a bit further on that slight rethinking of that structure.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is also one of the tricky bits when it comes to something like Deja Vu. It's the idea that you're absolutely right. It is almost like a support system, because the key things when it comes to any experience is that on a personal level, you're recognized. So, when you walk into a restaurant, it's almost unprompted, like, oh, like, Louisa, hey, I haven't seen you in a while. Like, I know that you like Merlot. Like, here's your glass of Merlot. And you're like, oh my God, like, I didn't realize that you remembered me. And it's sort of like that idea that it catches you off guard as well. That is the key to, it's exciting and it's flattering. But at the same time, if you have that in one experience at that particular cafe and then you go back and you don't have it again, or you only have it sporadically, it's almost the idea that you don't really have any control with that. And I found that difficult, because you just never can tell if your experience at a certain place is going to be on par with your last. And especially a place that you keep going to, you kind of want to keep that level of goodness, as I say, up there. So Deja Vu is absolutely like one of those support systems where I think as a service, it can allow restaurants to be able to still offer that level of experience to their customers while having the customer have some sort of idea or some sort of interaction with that as well, and allowing them to in turn have staff shifting around and not have to rely solely on that human interaction, but having a system in place that says, we need to remember these people, let's prompt our staff to do that.
How do you maintain the authenticity of that reaction? Because if the consumer is using the Deja Vu app, they know that support system is in place.
Yeah. And
whilst it is a support system, there is the threat that it will become conflated with the actual thing itself, rather like Facebook and Instagram likes and shares.
Yeah.
What defenses do you have in place or will have in place to make sure that the consumer knows that the restaurant values them and not how many points they've logged on the app?
Interesting. I guess it's based off of the fact that it's a dynamic app, right? So when consumers start using the app and they build up these tier points, it doesn't mean that they're always just going to unlock the exact same things every single time. And I think it's one of those things that the restaurant itself has to start paying a bit more attention, and that's on me as part of Deja Vu to provide to them the information to say, this is your changing consumer, this is what's working, this is what's not. And I think to some extent that level of engagement with their consumers will show them that they care. So I think like if you go to a restaurant or to a coffee shop and they say, well, every time you come in you get this point, but you will always exchange it for this exact same thing. I don't think that's experiential at all, because they're just rewarding you for your frequency, but they don't seem to care about you in terms of value, because what stops you from going anywhere else? I don't think they're monitoring that. But by allowing the restaurants the ability to use this data in a way that says, we know that our consumer is constantly changing, and it's not just about, getting new customers, but it's retaining the customers that we have. How do we keep engaging with them in a dynamic way? I think that's the main goal that I would like from Deja Vu to provide to the restaurants.
So because the restaurant's offering of the interaction is experiential, it says that what the customer has offered is not logging more points. The customer's offered something a little bit more human than that. The fact that that's what the restaurant returns says that the currency we're exchanging is not financial. I mean, well, if you get real economisty, every interaction we have is always going to be equal. There's no one in the world who gives something away for free, but that's not just about handing over money for a coffee. It's about being kind to someone and then getting friendship in return, right?
Yeah.
But because what the customer is offering is loyalty, and then the restaurant offers back an experience. They're saying that this is how we think of what you've given us. It's not, oh, you've given us so much money that we'll give you a little bit of a discount. It's, you've offered us so much loyalty, we're going to give you something that we'd give a friend and a loyal customer.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And I think also to that point, I think it's interesting, if we're looking at loyalty as a type of currency, as you just mentioned, the liquidity of that currency is an interesting thing to look at within this industry, because, for example, this is a closed loop system, right? So you come in and you trade your loyalty and you get something from the restaurant. But there's so many different other schemes out there that open that loop. So you say, okay, I can use these points in different places. And maybe part of where this might go in terms of deja vu, or, you know, if it's a totally different idea, is how do you open up that loop and say, we value you as a customer, but, you know, it's not just about the restaurant anymore. Maybe you can use your points and you can get an Uber so you can go back home, or maybe you can do something else. So I think there's different avenues in which you can explore the actual liquidity of currency, as loyalty as a currency.
And always remaining on that level above, which isn't just we'll pay for your cab, but like, you know, we want you to get home safe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Like staying up.
Yeah, it sounds
you
like...
drank a lot of wine, so here is an Uber.
Yeah, it sounds like deja vu is enabling relationships more than, like, it's the service aspect that's really important, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So how does it then, aside from this particular aspect that we've just talked about, how does it differ from other pre-existing loyalty schemes? How do you break into that sort of arena with places like chains where you can accumulate points within the chain system? Like, how does it differ in that sense?
So I guess, as we keep mentioning, it is really based on the experiences rather than the fiscal rewards. It's about understanding the behaviors behind what causes loyalty, so that you can then get that, again, the trifecta of retention, frequency, and value from your customers, which is something that we discuss at Develop quite a lot, actually. And it's the idea that, you know, creating those relationships not only makes it an enhanced experience for your customers, but as I mentioned before, it creates so much value for the restaurant as well in terms of their own staff and, you know, how they interact with their customers and what kind of feedback they're getting for their research and development, their new menus, and it's dynamic, as I mentioned as well. So I think that those are the three, four, a handful of things that make it stand out in the marketplace.
So when approaching a restaurant to get them on board with Deja Vu, is that how you would pitch it? Or what's your pitch to the restaurant?
My pitch, I haven't necessarily nailed down completely, but it differs depending on the place. I think the main thing when it comes to restaurants for them is the value idea. So, you know, like as I mentioned before, if you increased 20 people going to a restaurant from 2 to 3 per month, which is actually not that big of a jump when people are mostly in London, especially, are going out 4 times a week, spending about £70 a week or something like that. But when you give them a number at the end of the day where it's like, well, if you just look at the value of keeping 20 people on board, and it could be £170,000 a year, that's a huge number for restaurants because their profit margins are so low. They have to, you know, reinvest, open new restaurants, that kind of thing. But I think when you also say to a restaurant that even beyond that value, there's a huge gap in your understanding of your customer. I've been to restaurants where on a Friday, even, it's dead, but on a Monday it's busy. And when you ask the people who work on the ground, who are actually there with the customers, what's going on, and, you know, they might be able to access their booking system and say, well, we know that these people have booked on these days. They actually have very little information as to why that's happened. And I think being able to pair those two things up is something for both people who've booked and people who haven't booked, is something that they don't have access to. So it's the value mixed with the experiences, how I pitch it to restaurants.
And in terms of the value, once you've tapped into the understanding of that customer, you've not just got a return customer, you've got an evangelist.
Exactly. As I've become with a lot of restaurants as well, which are the first ones that I'm targeting.
Not for any reason.
Yeah, not for any other reason, so they're great.
So, moving on from Deja Vu, your personal experiences, because you're doing something really exciting. You're starting your own company.
Thank you.
You're getting it all off the ground by yourself. And what is it like to be in this sort of environment in London where, obviously, it's almost is it a saturated market? I feel everyone is coming up with ideas. How is it to be in the midst of all of that excitement?
It's exciting. I think it's really exciting. I think if I wasn't in London, it would have been harder for me to come up with an idea, just because you're sort of like, there's like a buzz around you, and we're like in this space now full of like entrepreneurs and innovators. Like it kind of gets you in the mindset to think about it, not only think about the idea but think that it's possible. So I think like being surrounded by so many people who have different ideas just sort of gets the juices flowing, if you will. So no, it is exciting, but there are definitely challenges associated with coming up with a startup as well, but because there are so many ideas.
So what are the challenges that you've faced along the way?
I think the biggest thing, for me at least, was everyone has ideas. Like every single person has some kind of idea that I'm sure they'd be like, let's make this into a business. But it's really about being disciplined enough to look into your idea and do your research and understand, like, is there actually a niche in this market? Do you really understand what this industry is? And I had to do that, like, as most people do, but like, you have to dig down deep. I started out thinking that I wanted to go into the spice trade, which I thought was exotic and exciting because, I thought like, with my chefing background and my love of food, like coming up with different like spices and all that would be totally fun. Still think it would be. But then when you really look at the market and for an idea like that, you're like, it's full of different suppliers. People have been there literally for decades, centuries, and the markup prices of how much you spend to create your spice mix to then sell it in the market is like totally basically zero. I was speaking to one of my friends who owns a chain coffee shop in London, and he was saying that they started selling their coffee in Whole Foods, but the markup was just ridiculous. Like they were getting hardly anything for it was mostly just advertising for them. So I think the hardest bit is really just being super disciplined about just making sure that your idea makes sense and seeing what else actually exists in that area. That was definitely one of the hardest things to do.
Kind of on a more personal note, how do you feel about yourself now that you're moving away from being an employee to being an entrepreneur?
It's exciting. It's also quite daunting because for the first time in my life, I am my own boss, which I'm like, woo! But also, again, back to that discipline thing, like, you need to wake yourself up in the morning and go and do these things, and everything is reliant on you. So now I'm the boss, I'm going to hire some people to join the team, I'm going to do the contracts. If something fails, it's my failure. And I think one of the things you learn very quickly when you have a startup is that you have to get used to failure, and you have to get used to being to change and being adaptable. So, your idea at the very beginning is always the best idea, and it's definitely going to work, and it's going to be successful, and you're going to sell it for millions. But in reality, you probably are not going to do that. And I think having a mindset of being in a startup is very different to being an employee where there's that security. Here, it's like you just have to take each day as it comes, work really hard, and see what happens, but expect that, there are going to be a lot of bumps in the road. And I think that's a really scary thing, but also quite exciting. So I'm excited.
What's the advice you would have given yourself maybe a year ago when everything was starting up? And
so I would have told little Ange, poor little Ange, to continue to be passionate about your ideas. Don't let failure or adversity stop you from trying to make it. Have a very detailed plan. So you might have an idea, but make sure you've really thought it through, especially the finances, and you've looked at the market and you've done your research, and just literally get out in the street and talk to people. It doesn't matter what your idea is, but you cannot undervalue what surveying people can give. Like just talking to people will give you an idea if it's going to work or if it's not going to work, and you'd be surprised how many times people would be like, I don't think that's a really great idea, and you'll be surprised. So I think just being open to the possibilities, but also doing a lot of work in the very beginning to make sure your idea makes sense is I think the best advice I can give someone.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
And best of luck with Deja Vu. I'm sure we'll be hearing about it in the news soon.
Yes.
And thank you to Rise for giving us a wonderful podcast studio and for making everything sound crisp and wonderful.
Right, we love you. Thank you.
Love you.
Yeah, so thank you very much, and join us in 2 weeks' time for the next episode.
Deja Vu will be launching into iTunes and Google Play in March. Download it there.